All right, welcome back to another live. I'm your host, Joseph Lewin. And if you've ever thought about starting a podcast or you've started a podcast and you're getting the ball rolling and you're struggling to get momentum, you're struggling to drive revenue through your show, then this is a podcast. This is an episode that you're definitely going to want to tune into. I'm really excited to have Jim Gilkey on the show. Known Jim for a while now. He started a show and been driving revenue through his show. And so I'm really excited to talk about some of the ways that you can actually make money through your B2B podcast. So, Jim, super excited to dive into this with you today.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. And I think enough conversations that we finished with the sentence, we should really record a podcast on this. I'm just glad that we're here and we're actually recording something.
Yeah. So typically I actually tell hosts not to do this, but your background and what you've done with shows is actually highly relevant. So you've started a podcast and you've actually, I think, had a similar strategy on accident as I have over the last few years. But then the way that you've structured your show is a little bit different with it being really short. So what was it that got you to start a podcast originally? How'd you end up doing podcasting?
Yeah, there were a few different pieces to this. So one, I had a business coach, CJ McClanahan, years and years ago, talk about how people are not likely to pick up the phone if you're in sales, but they're really likely to book a podcast with you if you're promoting them and their expertise. And now working at Scrappy ABM have a little bit of numbers behind that, 1 to 3% connect rate and getting meetings booked if you're just doing cold outbound versus 70-80% of the outbound turning into podcast guests. So it really does make a lot of sense. But unfortunately, back when I heard that advice originally, over 10 years ago now, it was something that fell on deaf ears. So I didn't do anything with it. I actually moved into a marketing role. I was tasked with starting ABM. And then I had a lot of questions. I had a lot of times that I stumbled and tripped up and eventually figured it out and did extremely well with an ABM program. And so much so, I reached out to the company Terminus, who is an ABM platform we were using, and asked if I could come work there. And with over 1,000% ROI and a story that I could tell to help sell the platform, it was a pretty easy decision for them. But when I first got into Terminus, started having conversations with marketers around what is account-based marketing, how do I get started? And many of the questions that they had were the exact same questions that I had when I was trying to figure this out myself. So I said, what would be a great avenue for teaching people about ABM and how to get started would be a show. And so I thought, what is a way that I can do, actionable advice, not 30,000 foot perfect view of the world, but when real, stuff hits the fan and you need to pivot, what does that look like? So having people that are in the trenches doing this, giving real examples, and then just understanding a lot of marketers are swamped. I mean, if you're a marketer that is tuning into this, you probably have 1,200 different tabs open on your computer right now. You know what I mean. And so I wanted my show to be, 6-minute average episode. And from there, needed some sort of hook to connect with people. So I had the account-based beverage idea of just, hey, what's your favorite drink? We've had everything from, soda to coffee to alcoholic beverages and all across the board. And I figured it was a great way to know the guest and for me to get to try a bunch of these different drinks. So whatever they have, I try with them. And it ended up working really well. Ended up driving a lot of eyes to my content. And as people started to learn about ABM, as they had some of those questions that they were asking kind of privately to themselves and afraid to reach out to anybody because they didn't want to be sold to, they were consuming my content. And that naturally drove them to conversations with me, evaluating our platform, and led to, years where I was top 2, top 3 salesperson at Terminus. So not necessarily the goal getting started. It was just to provide the value and help people find the answers quickly. But it's amazing when you do things for the right reason, there's a lot of other benefits that come.
Yeah, so it's really interesting because you kind of backed into it and then ran into the way to actually make money through your show on accident, which is Awesome. And when I started, I was not really looking to drive revenue at all. It was more of like a career building exercise for me and building relationships with people. And I didn't have any need to be driving sales at that point. And then, same thing. I've ended up driving significant revenue through the shows that I've done, but then also over the years, I've worked with clients to help them start a show that's driven millions of dollars in revenue through their show. And so, one thing I really want to take a second to explore is like what are the mistakes that people make when they're getting ready to launch a show to actually drive revenue. So I'm going to get your take on it in a second, but a couple of things that I've seen that really are make or break for a show, whether it's a podcast or a live show or whatever direction you're going to go. The first thing is you have to have momentum to run a show. As soon as you lose momentum, you're going to stop recording episodes. You're going to slow down, and you're just it's going to fizzle out. And that happens all the time with shows. And I've started multiple shows that have fizzled out myself. And so, that's really normal to lose momentum. So you really have to think going into it, what are the things that I need to have in place so that I can keep doing this for the long run? And I think the biggest thing that gives you momentum is when you close a deal or you get a speaking opportunity or you have any kind of opportunity that comes through the show that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise. That really builds that momentum. And so how do you structure your show from the beginning so that you make money as fast as possible? Ideally in like the first 3 to 6 months that you're running a show. How do you structure your show in a way where you're going to get those opportunities coming to you faster? And how do you structure your show to make it easy enough on you to produce, to create the show and keep it going so that you don't get bogged down in little details and maybe never even launch the show to begin with. So those are some of the big things. And I would say that the biggest mistake is just not focusing on how you're going to monetize your show from the beginning and not making that clear in your goal. So I'm curious from your experience, what you see the biggest mistake being that people make when they're launching a show.
Yeah, I think the very first thing you need to do is be realistic with your time and your bandwidth and start a show in the way that you can scale it. So one of the biggest reasons for me in starting account-based beverages it was the goal of 5-minute average episode, but ended up being 6-minute average episode, was just because I didn't have the bandwidth. I'm not going to take time during work to produce this show. And so for me, I have 5 kids at home. There's a lot of craziness that happens after 5 o'clock, but usually by 10 o'clock when they're all down, I have some time. And so the difference of a 5-minute show versus a 45-minute show is a difference of me going to bed at midnight or 1 versus staying up all throughout the night trying to edit this episode. The other piece with that is kind of closely aligned, is just having some sort of forcing function. So one of the great things that we talked about with going live is you have that on the calendar. You have to go live because people are expecting you to be there, and you have to know what you're going to say because you can't go back and edit it. For me, having this goal of Thirsty Thursday being the day that account-based beverages goes live each week, having that consistency that is a repeatable process that I know I can get an episode cranked out in a week and it goes live on Thursday, and I can set the expectation for my audience to be looking for that episode coming out each Thursday. That was a really big piece. But when I see people or I talk to people that have tried a show and it has failed, it has usually come because they try to do too much. They try to get a specific person versus being flexible and making relationships with the people that they have. And one of the biggest pieces for me from a relationship perspective was just the end of every single recording. I would always ask, now that you've been through this process, who do you think would be a good fit for this format of a show? And it is amazing how quickly you go from, I have a small group of people that I know and I'm really close with that are just doing me a favor, doing these first few episodes with me, to now I've asked each of them who they would recommend. I have a list of 15 to 20 names that I can go after. And Joseph, one of the best parts of this, I was 5 episodes in. I was talking to Declan Mulkeen, and he said that he was recording the episode in the mountains north of Madrid. And I'm thinking to myself, how am I 5 episodes into this show? And this is already like a global entity. So it is amazing when you lean into the relationships, when you try to leverage those referrals and do it in a short format. It's hard for people to say no. When I ask to spend 15 minutes and I ship them your drink and then I promote the heck out of them online, it's a pretty sweet deal for them. And so how do I make an offer that they can't say no to? How do I make this easy for me and for them in recording? And how do I make this a repeatable process so I can start to build some consistency and set that expectation that when Thursday comes around, you should be looking for account-based beverages to hit?
Yeah. So if you want to monetize your show, then you really have to think through the goal of the show up front. And we're going to dive into that a little bit because I think that is really the most important place to start. Because if you start out with a totally unrealistic goal when you're launching your show, your chances of success and your chances of driving revenue through the show are almost nothing. But I do want to piggyback on something you said before we dive into this. And I don't want to go too far because this could become a major tangent. But something you've mentioned a couple of times is the relationship that you're building through the show, and that's going to play into the goals piece of it, right? But one thing that we're all seeing that's going to change how everything's done, especially in marketing, is AI and how AI is going to, integrate into everything that we're doing. And I feel really strongly that the most important thing to be developing over the next 5 years actually isn't your skill in AI. And I'm dabbling with AI. I'm looking at ways to become more efficient, and I think it will change everything. And if you don't think that, then I think you got something coming. But the most valuable skill, I think, or the most valuable thing you can develop is relationships with other people. Because the more that AI is taking over menial tasks, which is what it's good at doing, the more people are going to want to have connection and relationship with other people. And the more that we're integrated, the more we're on screens, the more that we feel disconnected, and AI is only going to make that more extreme, the more that human relationship, the more that connection is valuable. And so, am I working on some AI skills to make myself more efficient, the way that we do things more efficient? Absolutely. But the thing I'm focusing on the most is how do I build really high quality relationships with other people? So that really brings us into the goal piece. So I think of it this way, and I'd love your perspective on it too. See kind of three types of shows or three goals that you could pursue. And every show is probably going to have a mix of all three of these things. But whichever one you pick is really going to determine how fast you see your revenue come through your show. So the first one is going to be building relationships with people that are going to drive revenue. So that would be goal number one, is relationships that drive revenue through your show. The second one is going to be thought leadership. So how can you position yourself as an expert? And then the third one would be audience growth. And just from my experience, what I've seen is if you focus on building relationships, you're very likely, especially if you do it well, to drive revenue through your show in the first 3 to 6 months. That's really a 3 to 6 month timeline. Depending on your sales cycle, you're at least driving opportunities and pipeline opportunities within the first 3 to 6 months at a minimum. But for me personally, and a lot of clients I've worked with, they've actually closed deals in 3 months of starting their show. Thought leadership, if that's your focus, where you're going to be the subject matter expert, is primarily you, maybe doing solo content, but the focus is on you, your expertise. You're going to drive inbound to your show that way over time. But I've seen that typically be like 12 to 18 months before you can even think about getting a return that would be worth the amount of time and effort that you put into it. And then audience growth, the monetization strategy for that is just totally different. It's either a brand play if you're a huge company and you're going to have to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars to be worth the effort to put into it on that side, or it's about growing an audience that you're going to monetize. And then your monetization is really different, which we can dive into a little bit more. But to actually get a return on your show with audience growth, that's, in my experience, 2 to 5 year minimum before you're going to see a return come back from that. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind when you're deciding what your primary goal is what timeline do you have to where you really need to drive those results for your show. So Jim, I'm curious how you think about that and if it's any different.
Yeah, very similarly. The timeline horizon for these goals is such a big piece of it, but also having in your goals, if you have that audience growth and that brand play in mind, there are some very specific things that you could do as you're starting to grow your show. And so we're not saying don't set any of those long-term goals or long-term visions. If there is, and I just saw this with Devin Reed and getting a brand deal, with a clothing company. If you're always wearing the same brand shirt, then there is a chance as your show grows and it becomes one of the top 5 podcasts, then if you have the video component that's taking clips and people always see you wearing the same kind of shirt, then yeah, there's a chance that you can get that. But that is not necessarily realistic for when you're just starting out. It is, in my mind, like the idea of, hey, my goal is to become famous. Well, that's not really a good enough reason for anybody to follow you. But if your goal is to be helpful or to lean into the relationships, then that definitely shifts the way that you start to think about the show as it gets started. And one of the biggest pieces that I had to learn, because a critique of myself is I can be too nice of a guy and just want to help and help and help and never have the ask, is when you have these goals of how you're going to monetize your show, if it is through relationships, there has to be a point where you ask, right? It could be at the end of recording with somebody, who do you know that would be a good fit for what we do? Or if you're recording an episode and you just shared a lot of information that can get people from point A to point B, it's offering up, hey, we can help with that. But if you never actually say this, then a lot of times people can't connect the dots on themselves. So it's trying to spell things out in a clear way for people, trying to be concise so that they understand and it's memorable for them. But there has to be some point where there is an ask and opening that door for the revenue to be able to come in. And that only comes from aligning your goals with how you want to monetize.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because when we're talking about these different ways to monetize your show, and I think my perspective on this hasn't changed that much over the last few years, but it's solidified a lot over the last year and a half because I have a YouTube channel that's not B2B. It's like it's me cutting logs and burning things and making stuff for my kids, and so I have between YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. I've gained about 80,000 followers over the last year, a little bit over a year and a half, and have over 80 million views on that channel. And I've made a grand total of probably like $4,000 or $5,000, and probably gotten about $5,000 in free product through that channel. And for the amount of time and hours I put into that, I'm probably making like $5 an hour. Like the return on that is extremely low. Even getting millions of views, it doesn't mean, or having tens of thousands of followers, it doesn't mean that you're going to drive revenue through your show. It doesn't mean you're going to make money. Now, that's kind of a fun side project, and I'm fine with that taking a long time to make money. It's really mostly just for fun. But having that experience, I've learned that growing an audience is extremely hard. It's extremely hard, and it takes personality, it takes intention, it takes a skill set that you have to develop over time. And so if your monetization strategy is based on growing an audience, you need to make sure whoever the host is of the show that they've got a good personality, that there's somebody that people actually want to watch, that they're interested in hearing from. That person probably needs to be good at like pulling in pop culture references, or pulling in things that are happening, talking about things that are going on in their life. They have to be good at telling stories. And most people in the B2B world, they're not good at that. And it doesn't mean you can't grow in that skill over time. But if you don't have that naturally, and you don't have somebody who's already grown a top 50 show, on charts, your chances of growing an audience and really doing well on that as your primary way to make money, it's tough.
Yeah, I do want to share one example. And I know you're not going to toot your own horn, Joseph. So I'll talk about a conversation we had recently, a couple of weeks ago, where we were discussing some of the top podcasts and what made those hosts so good at what they do. And for me as a musician, having been trained, having started out in school, studying percussion performance, like I know how much of it is playing and then how much more of it is actually listening and knowing what to listen for and being able to add things into that. Because you're the professional in this space, you're able to pull out things that I just don't realize because I haven't been in this space as long. And we had the discussion talking about the importance of vocal variety. You could have the best message in the world, and it might be your, general like personality. You might just be a really energetic person, but if you constantly have the same speed, you have the same volume, it's going to kind of come out flat. I like to think of the analogy people say, and you're on, live TV, like the camera adds 10 pounds. Well, when you go live with a show, it kind of takes away like 10% of your energy. So you almost have to be more
Definitely.
animated for that to come across, especially if it's audio only. And having somebody that can coach you through and can point those things out and help you develop the skill is such a difference maker when it comes to this show's actually going somewhere versus this person's nice and they teach me some things, but it maybe not has the legs to become one of those, global top 10, top 5 shows.
Yeah, I totally I totally agree with you on that, and it's not something that comes naturally to me. So, I mean, for me, I go to parties, and when I start telling a story, people interrupt me every time. I could pretty much never get through a story at all. Whereas my wife, just by naturally, she's way better at telling stories than me. And the funny thing is that I like to be accurate when I'm telling a story. So I'm not going to like typically generalize a lot. I'm going to try to be accurate on details. And she's just way better at engaging people uh, and telling stories in a way that gets people to pay attention to what she has to say. And so exactly what you're talking about is something that I've been working on for a long time, and I'm below average at it probably still because it's not natural to me. But one thing I'll say with that is, uh, if you're going to do a show and you're going to get people to be paying attention to what you're doing, you're going to drive audience growth. You do have to figure out how to be engaging, and so in a sense, you almost end up having to be an actor to a degree. But there's this fine balance between that where you want to be authentic to who you are. But what if you're authentically boring? Now, this is probably a conversation we should probably have an episode just purely on this. But if you're authentically boring, like when you go to share a story or you go to talk and everybody interrupts you, maybe your authentic self is just boring and it's something that you need to work on. And so the more that you practice working on being more animated, maybe a little bit more than you would be in real life, that's going to start translating through into your normal life too. And so the way that I look at it is less about, hey, I'm going to act on screen and I'm going to have more personality and I'm going to have more vocal variety, and then in life I'm just going to like keep being boring monotone. Instead, I'm practicing those things in normal conversation. How do
Right.
I
And
be
there's
more engaging? How do I get that vocal variety? How do I do that in normal conversations so that when I go live or when I'm on a show, it isn't acting anymore. It's become part of who I am to have more energy to come across and communicate more effectively.
Yeah, if you look at the unintended consequences of starting a show, especially working with somebody that knows how to take you from good to great, it impacts so many areas. Because when you start to work on what makes you exciting, what makes you engaging, when you're on a show and you're practicing those things, it's naturally going to come across when you're talking to a prospect or a customer. And from the scripting or acting perspective, being in sales, we write cold call scripts for people. And one of the things that we hear is just, I don't want to feel scripted. Well, you don't want to sound unnatural is probably more accurate of a statement, because if you watch any movie, they are scripted. They've memorized those lines, but they know them so well that they can add their own flavor and their own personality. And I think the piece that we are kind of dancing around but not saying directly is like, there has to be some emotion. You can't
Mm.
just have the information there. You can't just tell the story and have all the facts in order and expect people to not interrupt. You need to actually have the emotion as a part of this. You need to get excited. You need to let people see how much this means to you, and they're naturally going to pick up on some of that excitement. And so when you talk about a problem that you solve, if you're actually diving into the pain and how visceral that pain is, there's a story I go back to when I was in marketing. I would have my chief marketing officer ask for updates. Well, for me to provide an update for her, I would have to look at our, download of a CSV from Drift, a download of a CSV from HubSpot, download of a CSV from Google Analytics and all the other platforms. And I'm looking in this Google sheet, trying to match up this, company underscore first name, company name, and try to get this data to all align. And I'm just thinking, banging my head against the wall, like, this is not why I got into marketing. And so when you can start to articulate the pain and put people in those situations, like, that's when you have their attention. That's when the pain is resonating. That's when they're actually interested in hearing how you solve that. And so, kind of circling back to what we've been talking about this whole time, knowing the goal of your show, knowing how you want to monetize, that's going to end up making a lot of the decisions of how you go about telling that narrative when you actually go live or record your podcast.
Yeah, and we could go on all day, and I actually really I love talking to people. So we'll have to have a separate episode where you teach me how to have these shorter interview episodes, because I'm always like, oh yeah, I'll shoot for 20, 25 minutes. And then I just like talking to people and learning from other people. But my interview episodes always go way too long. So just to kind of round us back around, because the topic of this is, why B2B podcasts fail to make money. And then, what's the secret to actually doing that? And so to kind of land the plane, from my experience, and I know what you've seen also, if you focus the goal of your show first on building relationships with the right people. And, I agree with you that you have to be intentional if you want to actually drive revenue. So you do have to have asks. I think that could be again, a whole topic, because there's a lot of ways you can do that. That's not a bait and switch. I think if you only have people on who are prospects and you're going to just straight pitch them after the show, that's going to be a horrible experience for your guests. And unless they're ready to buy right now, you're going to ruin relationship with them. But at the same time, you do have to ask. You have to understand how to navigate that post-interview conversation so that you do get value, so that you can build relationships and build network. But anyway, if you start with the goal of building relationships, I've seen that your thought leadership grows at least as fast, if not faster, than when you purely focus on thought leadership, especially if you have more of a conversational interview than just like almost more like a journalist interview. And then also, if you spend 12 to 18 months interviewing people, you're going to start having a lot higher quality thoughts to share. And you're going to have naturally grown an audience just by the people who have joined you on the show coming on and sharing with other people that they know. So if you focus on building relationships for the first, let's just say 30 to 50 episodes of your show, you're going to naturally grow thought leadership. You're going to naturally grow an audience, and you're going to be able to drive revenue through your show. Because I have yet to see somebody start a show that is not focused on building relationships and consistently drive revenue for their show in the first year. Almost everybody that I've talked to who's starting a show that isn't focused on how do I build the highest quality of relationships with people who are going to move my business forward, they all say you got to do this for at least 12 to 18 months before you can expect to see revenue come through. So if you need to drive revenue, 3 to 6 months, or at least, strong pipeline in 3 to 6 months, focus on building relationships through your show, and the rest of those things that you want to see are going to come anyway.
Totally agree. You have to earn the budget for the long-term play with the short-term wins. So I think that's great. And I know we touched on a lot of topics. If there's anybody watching this, or if you are checking out this stream after it goes, if it's published, let us know what of those could be its own episode and what we could dive a little bit more into, because I think there's many more of these conversations to come for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if you're looking to start a show to drive revenue, especially if you're founder-led sale, you've got a business going, you've done $1 million or a couple million in revenue, and you're going, man, how do I level this thing up through a podcast? How do I make a podcast something that goes beyond, where I'm able to drive a lot of the content that I publish on LinkedIn or other platforms through a show? Definitely reach out to Jim, and he'd be happy to chat with you about how you can do that and help you kick off a show and launch it. And if you chat with Jim and he works with you to get a show launched, and you could work with me on actually launching the show. So really appreciate you jumping on, Jim. Super fun, and look forward to chatting again soon about driving revenue through your podcast.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thanks, man.